There were any number of times when Israel was on the road, going on their way to the Promised Land. Moses was still with them. They were meeting challenges here and there, when they had to take a difficult question to God, and a judgment was handed down. Now, I think you probably know that there are various and sundry categories of law mentioned in the Old Testament. There are laws, there are commandments, there are statutes, there are judgments. And it's this last, judgments, that is the cause or the basis of a lot of misunderstandings, I think, sometimes about Old Testament law. Take Numbers 15 as a case in point. It's often been cited. Numbers, the 15th chapter. I'm going to start in verse 32. While the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to the congregation. They put him in ward, I guess in the local brig, until it was shown what they should do. And the Lord said to Moses, "This man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And so they all took him outside the camp, and they all stoned him with stones that he died, just like God commanded Moses. Now, more than one silly atheist, in trying to diss the law of God for modern man, cites this kind of thing and asks, now, do you really think we should be stoning Sabbath breakers, adulterers, and thieves, and this kind of thing? The question is idle and ignorant, because whoever brings it up in that context is not acknowledging the fact that the law appears in a context. It is the context going back. I'll take you back to verse 29. This is immediately preceding what we just read. He said, one and the same law, verse 29, applies to everyone who sins unintentionally. Now, how in the world can you sin unintentionally? You know what you're doing. I think what he means by this is that it is not a deliberate, high-handed sin. In other words, a person who falls into it, weakness, or what have you. But anyway, you draw that conclusion by what you see and what follows. Anyone who sins unintentionally, whether he is native-born Israelite or an alien, you basically, this law applies to him. But anyone who sins defiantly, whether native-born or alien, blasphemes the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. Because he has despised the Lord's word, broken his commandment, that person must surely be cut off. His guilt remains on him. Now, that statement is immediately followed by a case. The law about the man gathering sticks is presented here as an illustration of a person who, not through weakness, not because of some circumstance, not through exigencies, but just says, nuts to you. I'm going to gather sticks on a Sabbath day if I jolly well please to do so. And so out he goes with a high hand and does it. The reason I think that I understand it unintentionally the way I do is because it is set in contrast to defiant sin. Every sin we do is certainly not defiant. We do them out of weaknesses, we do them out of problems, we do them out of a compromise. We have all kinds of reasons why we sin that don't take us to this place. Now, the man this is the case that's given to us here. It forms a part of what we would call today case law. Case law is a well-understood principle in a legal system like ours. Case law, also known as decisional law, is that body of reported judicial opinions in countries that have common law legal systems. Published court opinions include precedents, that's what courts before have decided, or rules governing future court decisions. In other words, whenever you have a guy in court, you're beginning to evaluate a case that's in front of you. You evaluate the statute law that you have, and you also take a look at decisions made by courts before you, stare decisis, they call it. And in the future, other courts will look back on what your court has decided in developing common law. That is how we actually decide cases like that. So what we have in the case of the man gathering sticks is a judgment as contrasted with a commandment or a statute. And this is one of the most important distinctions to understand about biblical law. There's an important question, though, that follows on the heels of it. What do you do when you don't have Moses to go straight to God with an issue that requires judgment? Now what? You know, Moses has gone to the mountain. God's not talking to anybody else. We're out here. We have a problem. How do we go about dealing with it? Deuteronomy 17, verse 8. This is an important scripture. You should make special note of it. Deuteronomy 17, verse 8. If cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits, assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God shall choose. Go to the priests who are Levites and to the judge who is in office at that time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. Now listen to what he says following this. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord your God shall choose. Be careful to do everything they direct you to do. Act according to the law they teach you and the decisions they give you. Don't turn aside from what they tell you to the right hand or to the left. No games. You didn't have to come in the first place, but you did come. A decision was handed down, and that decision, for the time being at least, takes on all the force of law. The man who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God must be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel, and all the people will hear and be afraid and will not be contemptuous again. So here we have a classic statement of making an example out of someone who has come to the court's rendered a decision, and he refuses to abide by it. And consequently, an example is made of him. Now, this scripture, along with a lot of body of biblical law, presumes an administrative and judicial structure. We aren't told very much about how that got done or exactly how it came to be. We know there were priests, we know there were Levites, we know what their job was. How did a person apart from being a priest or Levite become a judge in Israel? Answer seems to be he was probably an elder, but that there was some form of civil structure that appointed men as judges. Their job was to hear cases and make decisions which were binding, if we use that word, on all the people. It was case law. Now, what if at another time and another place a man gathered sticks for a fire on the Sabbath day, not in defiance, but out of necessity? Here we are. We have an unexpected cold front. Noah did not tell us anything about that coming down. So there was one, and they didn't have a Noah in those days to forecast cold fronts. So bang, here comes a very cold front roaring through when it was not expected. And we have this poor guy here whose wife is pregnant, starting into labor, and there's a definite need for a fire, some warmth, and some hot water. Judgments are authoritative, but they are also circumstantial. And by that I mean they focus on the circumstances that you're dealing with. In the case where the guy was stoned, he had no special need. There were no circumstances. There was no mitigation. He was in defiance. The word in Hebrew for it is high-handed. It was a high-handed sin. Okay? Now, we have a situation now where case law said that guy had to be stoned, but the circumstances are different. And thus, the judges that are in this day can look back at that case and say, no, this is different, this is why it was different, and in our judgment, this is what we are going to do. Now consider, in comparison with this, as another illustration of it, Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field on the Sabbath day. Boys are hungry. And without even thinking, I think they probably reached down, pulled off a head of grain, rubbed it between their hands, they walked along, popped it in their mouth, and chewed and ate it. Well, this was not good. The Pharisees condemned it, wanting to know, why do your disciples do that on the Sabbath day? Well, Jesus answers them in more than one word, but he said this. He said, if you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Jesus is saying the judges can decide to have mercy on a person when, technically speaking, he has violated the law. Shouldn't be really any surprise to us. It happens all the time in our court system. Whereas in many cases we have a thing called jury nullification, where the jury decides that in this particular circumstance, this guy is guilty according to the law, but he shouldn't die for it or he shouldn't go to jail for it in this circumstance. It may or may not be a good thing. You have to evaluate that, but that's our system. We have a set of judges and juries who make these decisions, and if they decide a man is not guilty, then he's free. And you can't even try him again under our system, which I'm glad that that can't happen. Now, what was wrong with what the disciples did on this occasion that got the criticism in the first place? Well, you couldn't harvest a whole field. Everybody knew that. You didn't get out there with all your servants and what have you and get them all together and bring your whole crop in on the Sabbath day. That was not allowed. Everybody knew that. Okay, well, can you harvest one handful? Well, yeah, I think you should be able to harvest one handful. What about two? Why not three? Why not four? And if four, why not a peck? And if a peck, why not a bushel? And you know, this is what happens. Most legislation, lawmaking, and so forth is line drawing. You draw a line somewhere that makes, where you can live with it, and you can enforce it if it's broken. It's, there was a long time in California they had no speed limit. They had a reasonable and prudent law that if a situation where you were driving was deemed by the courts or the officers to be a reasonable and prudent speed, you could drive 90 miles an hour on the back, way out in the middle of nowhere, California road. Well, it became really hard to enforce that. Pretty much impossible to enforce, really. And so they drew a line. Some of us remember back when they drew this line at 55 miles an hour, and not many of us liked that. Not very many of us paid very much attention to it. And eventually the government backed down on that one and stuck it back up to 70, and the enforcement loosened up to where most people on the freeways these days are running 80. But anyway, that's likely to change before too many months have gone by. So line drawing is what happened. Now, I hear all kinds of questions people ask about situations like this. The Pharisees' judgment was, and this was what they judged, that's what they decided, you can't even start with a handful. Don't even do that. Don't read it at all. And they made it substantively the law of the land. So from Jesus, we learn something very important. Judgments can be unnecessarily strict, even when they are rendered by the authority, in this case. They can lack the quality of mercy. So that's an important thing to throw into the balances on anything like this that you're thinking about. The Pharisees had turned their own judgments into the oral law, which in their mind carried all the authority of the law God handed down to Moses from Mount Sinai. It didn't matter if they decided on it yesterday. It was a part of that tradition. They considered it the law of the land. But they had a double standard. Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you." What's he talking about? He's talking about Deuteronomy 17, that you have judges. You take cases to them. They make decisions. You obey it. That's the way it is. Then he goes on to say, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads, bind them on men's shoulders, and they won't lift them with one of their fingers to move them. Now, we've never heard of anything like that in our legal system, have we? About people passing laws they won't obey themselves. Anyway, everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. Now, it's of passing interest, by the way, that law of tassels followed right on the heels of the judgment about a man carrying sticks on the Sabbath day. It was the very next item that followed it down. So I think what you're finding here is that the whole thing about tassels is circumstantial, and it's a judgment. It had a special meaning in the society of that time, a meaning that it does not have now, and to some degree didn't even have by the time Jesus came on the scene. I've gone into this in the book Law and Covenant, so I won't go into it here, that as the circumstances changed, the phylacteries and the tassels became a status symbol by the time Jesus was there, and that wasn't what was intended. So, does this mean that we should accept the judgments of the Pharisees in all things? No, not really. But this is a necessary background to something Jesus told his disciples. Matthew 16, verse 18. I say unto you, You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, that whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, this was not said just to Peter. Later he would deal with this again. But first of all, this is a thing that keeps coming up from time to time. What do you mean bind? What do you mean loose? This is really the New Testament statement for the church of what Deuteronomy 17 stated for Israel. You get a difficult matter, it's too hard for you, you get to the place, you go to see the judge. In this case, it is the church which assigns the judges and the people to hear these things. Later in Matthew 18, this is the oft-cited passage about go to your brother. You know, if somebody's got something against your brother, go talk to him. Then take 2 witnesses if he won't listen to you. And then verse 17, if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it to the church. If he neglects to hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say to you that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything they ask, it shall be done of them, for them of my Father which is in heaven. What you're reading here is the passing of administrative judgment from the Pharisees who sat in Moses' seat historically to the church. And I think it's very important. When did the passing of this actually take place? It's a rather interesting little event in John chapter 20, verse 21. Jesus has been raised from the dead. He has come back to the disciples again. And he said to them, peace be unto you, as my Father has sent me, I send you. And when he said this, he breathed on them and said to them, receive you the Holy Spirit. Whoever sins you remit, they are remitted. Whoever sins you retain, they are retained. This is the moment, I think, when the authority to make decisions for the church passed from the Jewish structure and establishment of the time to the establishment and the administration of the church as it would come to be after Pentecost. All that said, there's an important thing for you to consider as an individual. You only ask for a judgment when you are incapable of making it for yourself, or when it involves somebody other than yourself. In most cases, you can weigh the circumstances and you can answer your own question. You can decide for yourself. Doesn't necessarily mean what you decide is right. It just means you can do it, and you alone bear the consequences of whether or not it's wrong for you to pluck a peach off of your tree on the Sabbath day, that gorgeous, just beginning to get soft, color perfect peach ripened on the tree. Can you do it? Nobody can decide but you. Now, there's another interesting sidebar that illustrates and illuminates an ongoing problem. The holy days, we all know, are written law. They're right there on the page of Leviticus 23. They're there forever. The calendar is not. Now, I'll have to explain. Some fellow years ago published a booklet titled The Calendar God Gave to Moses. I never bothered to read the thing because I knew that God never gave a calendar to Moses. The reason I say I know that is because Scripture tells us that God told Moses all kinds of stuff, and Moses wrote down everything God told him. And you can go all the way through there and not find any instructions for a calendar, just not there. You find that there is one. You get indirect references to the existence thereof. You get illustrations as to what people at the time did relative to it, but instructions to do it, how to do it, it's just not there. Now, here's the problem with that. As I said, Moses wrote down everything that God told him. Therefore, there is no calendar in the written law. There is reference to, in history, the existence of some sort of calendar. Now, the calendar then falls in one of 2 categories. It either falls under customs or it falls under judgments. Who made the judgments? Who gets to make that decision? We know next to nothing about a calendar system from Moses himself. It's just not there. We know it was one because the festivals are placed into it, but as for rules, there aren't any. For example, there is absolutely nothing to describe what constitutes a new moon beyond the name new moon. In some cases, they kept a new moon festival for 2 or 3 days, which doesn't tell us anything about the new moon really itself. And of course, you can't arrive at hard, things just based upon what somebody out there did. They might have been wrong for all we know. We just know what they did. Okay. As I say, there is nothing in the Bible that describes what a new moon is. Now, there is out there, among holy day keepers today, one group that renders a judgment that the moon is new immediately upon the conjunction. You know what the conjunction is? That's the moment when the moon coming across the sky passes the sun. And so consequently after that, the moon will then start beginning to show the little crescent and going all the way around the full moon and so forth. So that's what they feel, that is true. Another group out there renders a judgment that the new moon can only be proclaimed upon the observed new crescent. Now, I've had both those groups on my forum for years, and neither one of them has managed to make a dent in the other one in all that period of time. I have not found any of them changing their opinion on this. So the net result of it is, if you're going to have this as an issue, you're going to split the church immediately, because some of them will decide it's the conjunction, others of them will decide the observed new crescent, and there is another group that feel the observed new crescent must be in Jerusalem. And there's nothing in the book that says that either. Another example revolves around the adjustment of the lunar year. Why does the lunar year need adjustment? Well, because you probably have noticed this yourself, there aren't exactly 30 or 31 days in the month between one full moon to another one. 29, is it, or a quarter, something like that? I forget. Well, every so often then, the 12-month calendar starts walking the holy days back away from that season of the year when they're supposed to take place. So there are any number of places, not any number, but there are a few places in the Bible where it is clear from what's counted off that they were inserting a 13th month. We know that's what they did. We also have Jewish tradition down through time that that's what was done and still is done on the Hebrew calendar this day. Okay, what do we do about this? One group renders a judgment that the new year can only begin after the equinox. Never mind, the word equinox is not in the Bible. Another group rules it can only begin when green ears of barley are seen in Jerusalem. Why in Jerusalem only? Well, you've got a latitude consideration, because you see, if you go very far north, the green ears show up much later. If you go very far south, Egypt, for example, they will show up earlier. And of course, when were we told that was the beginning of months? And where were we? We were in Egypt, not Jerusalem. But, that's neither here nor there. The equinox is not mentioned anywhere, nor are there any instructions about green ears. After all, as I said, it was called green ears in Egypt, and that was earlier. Now, people string together their proof text, make some assumptions, and they render a judgment as to what they are going to do about the calendar. It's not, however, binding upon the church as a whole. If an individual decides he wants to do that, we may wonder why he didn't show up on Pentecost, and he'll be back the next week, and we have no idea where he was or what he did. Turns out he made his own decision about what he was going to do there. Now, I want to give you a little modern history. Sometime in the 1930s, a man named Herbert Armstrong began observing the festivals of Leviticus 23. There may have been others that were doing that at the time, but he was unaware of them. I think there were in South America. I'm just not really sure of the whole history of that. Making his best judgment, he decided to follow the Hebrew calendar, which was the oldest known calendar authority. He based his decision, in part, on something Paul wrote to the Romans. Romans 3:1. What advantage has the Jew? What profit is there of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? The word oracles is interesting because the Greek word for it only shows up 4 times in the New Testament, and there are other words that are used having to do with the law, the commandments, and so forth. And so consequently, Mr. Armstrong took it to include issues like the calendar, that was given them to take care of it, and they have done it, however imperfectly. But the key element involved in the whole thing is that there is agreement. Not so much whether they are perfectly right on everything that comes along. Now, as far as we know, Mr. Armstrong actually took it to include issues like the calendar, and we have no record of Jesus or the apostles ever having an issue with the temple calendar of the day. When I say we have no record, I mean we have no record in the New Testament that they ever had a problem, and if they did, trust me, it would have been there. So as far as any of us know, the Hebrew calendar was the authority. Now, back in those early days, there was an annual ministerial conference. All the elders came together once a year, and we all kicked around every kind of thing that there was. First one I ever attended, I wasn't ordained yet, and I was fascinated because it was a knockdown drag-out at some points in it where they were arguing about this and discussing about that. And I remember seeing Mr. Armstrong nail a couple of hides to the wall. But in the end of it, they all came to the place to where they said, this is what we are going to do. It wasn't about the calendar. It was about something else, which has been lost in the mists of time and probably should have been. But sometime back in the earliest days, this calendar issue was raised. It was decided. It wasn't just fall into it. And the ministry of the whole of the church agreed to it. When the Church of God International formed in 1978, at one of the first ministerial conferences we ever had, where we had every elder in the church was present up here on South Broadway, just a little bit north of here. Yes, that's where it was. And we, all of us sat around a couple of tables and we talked this over, and one of the issues on the agenda was whether or not we would change the calendar. After some short discussion, the decision was made unanimously that we would not take upon ourselves the authority of the calendar. We would continue to follow the Hebrew calendar as the church had done since somewhere back in the 1930s, before I was born. Okay, the only real differences the Church of God International had with the old church were really administrative, and this was an administrative matter. And concluding that we had the right to decide it, we decided in a way not to decide it. The church acted within its authority in making the decision about the calendar, as much as anybody would. We assumed that it was bound in heaven. That is to say, it was accepted by God as the authority for our community. Simple. That is the authority. Up until then, by the way, another interesting example is in the day of Pentecost, a change which occurred 77 about there. Up until then, we had always observed Pentecost on Monday. I won't go into the arguments for it. They're kind of fun all by themselves, but we observed Pentecost on Monday. Well, at that point, finally, all the arguments began to gel and come together, and the decision was made we would begin to observe it on Sunday every time. It had always been a bone of contention during all those years, and we had struggled with it, and once we got that done, it more or less disappeared as an issue. Now, here's what I think is important about this. It was not so much a matter of hardcore right and wrong. It was a matter of judgment and the authority to make a decision for the community on a doubtful matter. And I'll guarantee you it was a doubtful matter. It was a political football for a very long time. I think God accepted our judgment, believe it or not, in both cases, not because it was right or whether it was wrong, but because it was made by those in authority in the church and made in good faith. I think he accepted that decision, and I can't tell one whit's worth of difference in the way we were blessed before it, because we were, and the way we were blessed after it, because we were, although we had other problems that came on the scene that had to do with other things. Now, there is one other bone of contention that bears on this issue as well. That's when the church should observe Passover, and why should it be observed when we do? Someone recently observed to me, in fact it came in an email just the last few days, that the Passover is the one holy day that can be moved because of circumstances. It's not true of any other holy day, and I had kind of forgotten it, although I'd heard it before. Somebody pointed this out. It's Numbers chapter 9 and verse 6, if you're going to follow me in the Bible. There were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man. So they couldn't keep the Passover on that day. And when they came before Moses and Aaron, and they said, we can't take, we're defiled by the dead body of a man. Wherefore are we kept back that we can't make an offering to the Lord in his appointed season among Israel? Why is it we can't do this just because of this? And Moses said, stand still, and I'll hear what the Lord will command concerning you. Here comes judgment. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If any man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off. They didn't ask him about that. That got tossed in addition. Yet he shall keep the Passover to the Lord. The 14th day of the second month at even shall they keep it, and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So, it is one holy day that can, because of circumstances, be shifted. The judgment was given. It can be shifted 1 month later, and you do it exactly the same as you would have done it before. I have no idea what God would have us do regarding the days of unleavened bread in that circumstance. That's another question for another day. Now, what makes this of special interest to us is what's called the synoptic problem. John, in his gospel, shows the Jews eating the Passover at the end of the 14th, actually on the 15th, while Jesus kept it with his disciples at the evening beginning the 14th. In other words, 24 hours before the Jews did. What I think happened here is that Jesus, acting on his authority as a judge, moved it forward 1 day instead of a month later, as it is done in the Old Testament. In other words, he rendered a judgment. With desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I think he had the authority to do that. I think that's precisely what he did. But then comes another question on the heels of that. Should the church then revert back to the position of the Pharisees, in other words, the position of the written law, that the Passover is crucified late in the afternoon of the 14th, roasted with fire and eaten on the 15th? A lot of difference of opinions about this I won't go into here today. Well, as it happens, we have Paul's judgment on this issue. It isn't as though nobody told us. Paul did. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 18. First of all, when you come together in the church, I hear there be divisions, Greek schisms among you, and I partly believe it. For there must also be heresies among you, that they who are approved may be made manifest among you. The Greek word for heresy, actually, and heresy is a Greek word by itself. What the word means is the cause of division or schism. He said it has to happen so that they who are approved may be made manifest among you. When you come together, therefore, into one place, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. You're not doing it that way. You're doing it and eating your own supper, and one is hungry, another is drunk. What? Don't you have houses to eat and drink in, or despise you the church of God, and shame them that have not? Shall I praise you in this? No way. For, here's what he says, I have received of the Lord what I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it, said, Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. What Paul wrote to the Corinthians was very simple, very straightforward. What I got from Christ, I delivered to you. We do this from now on in the night in which Jesus was betrayed. And as far as I know, we've got near universal agreement that that was the nighttime portion of the 14th day of the first month on the calendar. There may be somebody around that differs with that. I'm just not sure. Now that I think about it, I think there are those who believe that Jesus was crucified on the 15th, which would place this at the beginning on that night, but that really doesn't hold up from any kind of careful exegesis of the gospel accounts. Thus, the considered judgment of the church, for as long as I have been involved, is that we observe the Christian Passover in the night in which Jesus was betrayed in perpetuity, once a year. Now, to underline one important thing in all of this, I want to take you back to a very old passage. Genesis chapter 26, verse 2. The Lord appeared to Isaac. He said, don't go down into Egypt, because he was tempted because of a famine in the land. Don't go down there. You sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For unto you and to your seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your seed multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give unto your seed all these countries, and in your seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Notice anything interesting there? What's missing? Judgments. Now, why are there no judgments here? The answer is really very simple. There was no administration as there was in Israel. Abraham was a clan chief. He had his household, had his own servants. He had, I think there were probably 1,000 people at one time, men, women, children, and so forth, that were a part of his overall household. But his word was law. Whatever he said was what went. So he made judgments for himself and his family, and we don't worry that much about any judgments involved in it because judgments lack the permanence of statutes, commandments, and laws. They just do. They sometimes have to be changed. So, I would say this, there was no administration where in the case of Israel, you had to have an administration. Everyone had to follow the same laws and the same precedents, or you wind up with total chaos. So where there is no administration, you are free to render your own judgments, and you are free to bear the consequences. Doesn't mean your judgment's right. It just means it's yours. But when there is an administration, God says, he seems to say, he backs it up. When it's wrong, he will correct it. If you know it's wrong relative to God's law, you have a personal obligation not to obey. But then we have to go beyond that. Jesus rejected the decisions of the Pharisees while he accepted their administration for the time. No argument with that. In the history of the church, those authorized to judge matters like these have heard them from time immemorial. I think we had, in years gone by, made judgments in areas where we really shouldn't have. It's just no point in it. Sitting in a Friday night Bible study and someone sends up a question that says, is it all right to wash dishes on the Sabbath day? The minister didn't have to read that question. If it had been, I don't think I would. I think I'd just toss it back in the basket and go on. Because once you step into that, the question is, well, can I rinse out my coffee cup? Well, if I can rinse out my coffee cup, can I rinse out the saucer? And can I do mine and my husband's cup and saucer? And you know where you go from that type of thing. Next thing you know, you've got a whole list of do's, don'ts, and all this line. You just don't want to do that. Those things are for you to decide. The decisions that those in authority are authorized to judge are the decisions that have to do with the church acting together. Now, it isn't easy to turn around decades and centuries of tradition, and it should not be easy to turn them around. Ephesians chapter 4, which has an interesting thought on this, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14. Paul says all these things he says that we're here for, including the elders, pastors, and all the people who are in authority in the church. He said, these are here that we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about by every doctrine, and the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. But speaking the truth in love may grow up unto him in all things which he is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplies, according to the effectual working and the measure of every part, makes increase of the body in the edifying of itself in love. Okay, so what should you do if you feel your church, and I'm not just talking to this church, I'm talking to the camera back there as well. What should you do if you feel your church is wrong about something? Well, in this church, and I think it's probably true in many places, depending on the size of the church, there are two bodies of judgment here. One is the council, the other is the elders. If you can't get something changed in one of these bodies, presented to the church for the church to decide it, it probably shouldn't be changed at all. Because all we're having to do is just drift on down the road doing the same tradition and trying our best to be faithful to God. John 7, verse 21, in conclusion. Jesus had performed a miracle. They'd said they were going to kill him for it, and he knew that and said so, and they thought he had a demon. And he said, I've done one work, and you marvel. John 7:22. Moses gave you circumcision, not because it's of Moses, but the fathers. And you on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath day receive circumcision, so the law of Moses shall not be broken, what he's doing is pointing out to the fact you are inevitably going to come across situations where one law will conflict with another. There's an idea some people have got that that's not possible. God would never let that happen. Hey, the law is about human beings, human life. And there are times when circumcision, which is considered an act of work, it takes place on the Sabbath day. They made that decision. The priests profane the Sabbath in the temple, and Jesus said they're blameless. Okay, and you're angry at me because I made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day. Hey, boys, don't judge by appearance. Judge righteous judgment. Judgment is an absolute essential for any church organization, or what. And those decisions have to be consistently applied, or else you're not going to be able to do anything together. You'll be all over the landscape, and we've seen enough examples of that in our lifetime. Judge righteous judgment. It's a challenge that rings down through the ages, and it's the principle that enables us to act together instead of being blown about all over the landscape.